Hi, so welcome to the 2004 Workshop 2. And well, it's quite sad, it's not many of you. Someone told me guys having test week and stuff. I hope the others will get to come on Thursday, and I mean, it's quite important, especially for this essay. But in any case, I mean, yeah, we can always proceed. So just some basic things. The following are my contact details. Should you have any questions regarding the essay, feel free to email me. To schedule an appointment, or feel free to email me any one of your questions, all right? As you all know, I'm normally found in the writing hub, and I do entertain people, of course, if you've set up an appointment. Yeah, so that's highly imperative. Yeah. So for those of you who are coming to my workshops for the first time, last week I put across a disclaimer. Please do not reference my slides, otherwise you might lose marks, right? So you referencing my slides reflects that you've not done your homework, you've not done your research, because I mean, the basis of this workshop is not for you to copy what I'm saying, but essentially to draw ideas in order for you to be able to write a cohesive as well as coherent essay, all right? So take note of the disclaimer. I've communicated this to you, and in case you're penalized for using my slides, by using my slides, I mean you citing my name, of course, Mbewe 2015, as some of you did in first semester. So yeah, please don't do that. Yeah. Yeah. Some of you look sad. Did you want to reference me? Anyway, so what we're going to do essentially today is I will do a recap of Workshop 1, just to give you some flavor of what we covered last week in order to, to bridge into Workshop 2. But more importantly, we will define what monetary policy is, and we'll go ahead and define what a liquidity trap is. And an important aspect of this essay, of course, is how to propose policy, and better yet, what policy considerations can you offer for the Eurozone, all right? So in so doing, we'll try and define what is a policy objective, and more importantly, what is a macroeconomic policy objective. And we'll try and understand if you impose a policy, or rather if you implement a policy, how do you determine whether it has been achieved or not? So, right, you need your checks and balances. And of course, your policy considerations effectively depend on your initial disposition. So it depends on what angle your essay would have taken, all right? But anyway, we'll get to understand this a little bit more. So just to do a quick recap, right? So when you think of this essay, 3 important questions that you need to address, all right? That is you want to analyze whether, the effectiveness, sorry, let me come back to this again. So you're trying to analyze the effectiveness of, an austerity fiscal policy using the ISLM framework. So at all costs, please try and do this within your essay, all right? The second question you want to address is whether there is room for monetary policy. And the last question you want to address, of course, is to provide policy recommendations, which are quite important, all right? But as I mentioned, your policy recommendations effectively depend on your initial disposition. Are you looking at this essay from a country perspective? Are you looking at this essay from a regional perspective? By a regional perspective, I mean, are you considering the Eurozone in this regard? So this is what we discussed last week, and I provided 2 approaches. And of course, option 1 includes you looking at the Eurozone on average, right? So this means in your discussion, you will focus on, whether the fiscal austerity has been effective within the Eurozone on average, all right? Whether there is room for monetary policy in the Eurozone. And when you provide policy considerations, these need to be tailored for the Eurozone, all right? If you choose option 2, that is focusing on a specific country in the Eurozone, you need to analyze the effectiveness of fiscal austerity, right? Using the ISLM framework of that particular country. You need to also analyze whether there is room for monetary policy for that country. And you need to provide policy recommendations for that country, all right? So do not move off, go off track by, looking at this essay from, let's say, for instance, an aggregate level. That is, looking at this essay from a regional perspective. Then later on, you make policy considerations for a country. that will be problematic, all right? But of course, I mean, there's certain things you might need to do. That is, you need to, in discussing the Eurozone, of course, you cannot eliminate the fact that you might need to discuss a specific country. I will highlight this in due course. So this essay wants you to use the ISLM framework, right, to analyze the effectiveness of fiscal austerity. But of course, an important aspect of this is we are not looking at you setting up the ISLM framework and trying to look at how you derive the IS curve or LM curve. What we're more interested in is what shifts the IS curve, what shifts the LM curve. And in this regard, what shifts the IS curve, as we discussed last week, is essentially the changes in government spending and the changes in taxes, all right? So it's also important to note that when you look at the changes in government spending and the changes in taxes, this is what you technically call fiscal policy, all right? Then if you look at the changes in money supply, this is what shifts the LM curve. And effectively, this is what we call monetary policy, all right? So these are some of the things to take note of. So in drawing up your essay, in trying to analyze these various shifts, all right, due to, let's say, if it's a policy consideration or you trying to analyze, you know, the fiscal austerity measures, please do not mix these two. I mean, don't talk about an increase in government spending and call it an expansionary monetary policy. That's highly contradictory, and I think that even warranties a zero, all right? That shows you don't understand what you're talking about, okay? So, yet again, last week we discussed fiscal policy, and of course, what we mentioned was that fiscal policy is essentially the use of government spending as well as taxes to influence aggregate demand or the level of economic activity in the economy, all right? So when you look at fiscal policy, it can be expansionary or contractionary. So expansionary meaning that you increase government spending and or reduce taxes, all right? So it means you've got more money in the system, all right? So you could introduce an expansionary fiscal policy for various reasons, all right? It could be maybe the economy is going through a recession, and when the economy is in a recession, remember, private demand effectively goes down. And when private demand goes down, who stimulates the economy? Quite often than not, it's the government who increase government spending and increase money in circulation, thereby increasing aggregate demand, all right? So if it's a contractionary fiscal policy, the reciprocal happens. You've got a reduction in government spending and or an increase in taxes. All right? By and or, I simply mean either you might use them simultaneously, or you might choose to just increase government spending and call it expansionary, or reduce government spending and call it contractionary, right? So it depends on what the policy objective is. And an important aspect we talked about last week was the issue of fiscal austerity, all right? So with fiscal austerity, essentially, we mentioned that this is a reduction in government spending. And in fact, I should alter this definition. I'll change it in the slides. It's supposed to be, you know, a reduction in government spending and or an increase in taxes, all right? Because when you think of fiscal austerity, at the end of the day, you're just trying to reduce expenditure. So what generally happens is you might choose to reduce government spending and increase taxes, or do both, right? Reduce government spending and increase taxes. But the sole, you know, aim of an austerity measure is essentially to reduce the budget deficit, which I mentioned. I think I went in a lot of detail last week. You're trying to reduce the structural deficit, all right? So when the deficit is structural, essentially, you mean it's permanent. So it's not attributable to factors, you know, on the business cycle. Because there are times when you incur a deficit because the economy is in a recession, right? That's more or less of a cyclical deficit. So when the economy is in a recession, remember, private demand is extremely low. So government will intervene by increasing government spending and or reducing taxes. That's more or less expansionary. But in increasing government spending, remember, government sometimes may not have the funds, right? So they might borrow from the domestic economy, and that increases the fiscal deficit. But effectively, when the economy is out of the recession, the deficit might be gone later on when aggregate demand goes up and government collects more money from tax revenues, etc. But with the structural deficit, it's permanent. It's going on and on and on, thereby leading to an increase in the debt to GDP ratio. All right? So it would be important, in fact, within your essay to actually mention that the deficit you're trying to shrink is structural. I mean, it shows the marker or the reader that you've got a good commander of economics, all right? To be able to use the jargon and all these fancy terminologies, but yeah, cool. So essentially today, I think it's time we dive into the cracks of this presentation. And we are trying to look at the role of monetary policy, all right? So an important thing that you might want to consider yet again, I think Richard may have mentioned something to you guys, is it's regarding the stakeholders or the role players, right? So when you talk of fiscal policy, try and refer to the government as the fiscal authorities, all right? If you talk of the Reserve Bank or the central bank, try and refer to them as the monetary authority, all right? When proposing policy, all right? So if you talk of an expansionary fiscal policy, say the fiscal authority might consider this, or you might as well say government. But I think fiscal authority is more authoritative. I think to some extent it carries more weight and it draws a very clear-cut distinction. All right. So talk about government, you say fiscal authority. Talk about the central bank, talk about the monetary authority. All right. So essentially, when you think of monetary policy, I mean, this is essentially how the central bank influences money in the economy. All right. Or rather, how they influence the macroeconomic objectives in the economy by using interest rates or money supply, all right? So there are times when government wants to, inflation rates are rising substantially and government wants to, to reduce inflation. As you know, South Africa has got, for instance, an inflation targeting policy. So if inflation is, above the, rather outside the confidence interval, the central bank might choose to maybe raise interest rates. So what does raising interest rates do? So what they do effectively is just raise the repo rate, right? So when you raise the repo rate, this means that borrowing becomes expensive. Saving becomes more appropriate, right? So what does this do? It removes money from the economy. And you know what general inflation is. In the most basic term is, too much money chasing too few goods, right? So you raise the interest rate, money leaves the system, and inflation is controlled. That's the basic understanding you need to have around this. And of course, it could be expansionary. I should have altered this as well, because sometimes monetary policy does not only involve manipulating interest rates, it also involves manipulating the money supply, right? Especially when it comes to the Reserve Bank. So they might choose to print more money and flat it, just put it in the economy, or rather put it in the economy. And this could be done in various ways. One of the things I will talk about later on is quantitative easing, all right? We'll talk about quantitative easing. But more importantly, monetary policy could be expansionary, it could be contractionary. So when you're using interest rates to manipulate this, you might choose to decrease interest rates, right? Not you, but of course the monetary authority, they might choose to reduce interest rates. So when interest rates go down, it means the cost of borrowing becomes cheaper. When the cost of borrowing becomes cheaper, it means you can go to the bank and borrow at a very good rate. All right. So what generally happens? Anyway, this is just outside the the essence of this presentation. But when you look at the repo rates, right? So it moves from the repo rate, it goes to the prime rate, goes to the domestic lending rate. So most people normally confuse this, right? So when the central banks say we're going to increase the repo rate, how does this filter into the economy? So how the central bank influences this is when they manipulate the repo rate is the rate at which commercial banks borrow from the central bank, right? Because you cannot go and borrow from the central bank. So if the rate at which the commercial banks borrow from the central bank goes up, this means that the commercial banks need to adjust their rates as well to make a profit. So when they adjust their rates, they've got what you call a prime rate. So a prime rate is the rate at which they lend to big corporations. Then they've got what you call a lending rate, a domestic lending rate, is what they lend to you and I, right? But of course, the lending rate is normally higher than the prime rate because you are more of a risk, right? So that's how it all filters into the economy. I just thought you guys should know that because I know sometimes it can be a little confusing. So an important aspect, yet again, when it comes to this essay, and I'm not sure whether some of you have noticed this, but it's to do with what we call a liquidity trap, right? So essentially, a liquidity trap is when you've got interest rates in an economy that are asymptotically or approximating zero, right? So they're approximating zero, and what's actually happening is you try and pump in money into the economy just to drive down interest rates, right? But normally this situation happens when, regardless of you pumping in money into the economy, not you, but of course the monetary authority pumping in money into the economy, interest rates are close to zero and people are not borrowing at all. Private demand remains substantially low, right? So for some of you who've read the question, you might choose to relate liquidity, the liquidity trap to part of the question that says private demand has substantially gone down and interest rates are somewhat ineffective. This is within the question. You might want to look at that, okay? You might want to look at that. I don't want to talk much about that because, I mean, it's part of the question. You guys, are patrons of the art when it comes to economics and you understand these things. So, yeah. Do you understand what I'm talking about? Do you guys understand what I'm talking about? Who knows what a liquidity trap is? Okay. Okay. Oh, she wants to tell us what a liquidity trap is. Yeah. Yeah. Pretty much. So interest rates are close to zero, right? But no one, because generally, the basic idea is if people are able to borrow at very cheap rates, this increases investment. Investment is a component of aggregate demand, right? So this effectively reflects on output. So aggregate demand, when you use the basic Keynesian model of income and spending, aggregate demand is equal to output. I mean, if AD is going up, which means output effectively might go up. But I mean, if interest rates are approximating zero and people don't want to borrow, it could be for various reasons. As mentioned there, they could be expecting a deflation, so they decide to hoard money. So they hoard money, just keep it, wherever they are, and decide not to spend the money. And of course, this is out of the financial system, all right? It's within the economy, but not it's in circulation, but not actually technically in circulation because they're just keeping the money. It could be in their home, all right? So that's how you begin to think about a liquidity trap. But anyway, I'll mention this later on, and it will become more apparent when we look at the case of the Eurozone and the question. And an important aspect is, if you talk of a liquidity trap, because you don't have an influence on interest rates, you're likely to find that the curve will actually be horizontal. That is, the LM curve is likely to be horizontal, meaning it's going to be a straight line like that. All right? It's important to understand that. It's going to be a straight line. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Mm. Sorry? Yes. Yeah, because look, so her question is she doesn't understand. Earlier on, I mentioned that the Reserve Bank or the central bank actually influences the economy by, fiddling with the repo rates or what people technically call the interest rate. But then in this case, we are saying that the Reserve Bank is unable to control the repo rate, or there's no effect on the repo rate. So what generally happens is you need an incentive to borrow, all right? You need an incentive to borrow, or you need an incentive to lend, all right? So at the end of the day, what influences that is the repo rate, all right? And an incentive to borrow could be if the interest rate is very low. So you want to borrow money. If the interest rate is very high, you as an individual, you want to lend money to, let's say, for instance, a commercial bank. But in the case of a liquidity trap, what's actually happening is interest rates are extremely low, all right? But because remember, when you look at the monetary authority, they work, simultaneously with, the fiscal authority to achieve the macroeconomic objectives of course, price stability, reducing unemployment, et cetera, and maintaining, the balance of payment stability. But at the end of the day, so the interest rate is approximating zero. Intuitively, you would expect that. If the interest rate is close to zero, you would expect a lot of people to borrow, all right? But bear in mind, you've got a case where private demand is very low and you're trying to stimulate private demand. Regardless of the monetary authority setting the interest rate at zero, no one is borrowing because they expect there will be deflation in the economy. So you know deflation. So deflation means money technically is below the inflation par, right? So if you've got inflation, money buys less goods. Deflation, it's the reciprocal. Or sometimes you might have a case where you expect a war, right? So when you expect a war, what generally happens is rising fiscal deficits and inflationary environment. So you borrow at this rate, and when you're paying back, you pay back at a very high rate. So what people actually generally do is they won't borrow money at all, or they will hold whatever money they have. Yeah. So that puts it in a liquidity trap. So regardless of the monetary authority pumping in money, because remember, when you think of the interest rate, it's a price at which money is, you borrow money pretty much. It's a price of money. So if the monetary authority are pumping in more money, more into the economy, you would expect interest rates to go down, right, substantially. But the interest rates are approximating zero. They can't go down any further. People are not borrowing, and this is not increasing investment. Yeah.
Does this affect all financial institutions? Like, does it affect banks directly, or does it affect asset? Those that you said there was assets and investments and stuff like that. Are they also affected?
Yeah, it filters into everything because remember, interest rates to a larger extent are intertwined. They're actually connected because if you talk of bonds, they're actually connected to interest rates. So one way or the other, when you talk of financial assets, they're all interlinked. So they will be affected to a larger extent. But try and look at it from a very basic picture. Just look at it from that angle of a liquidity trap. The monetary authority not being able to influence the level of borrowing in the economy so that they can, raise aggregate demand.
So how a country or region get out of this trap?
It's a very good question. That's part of essentially the policy considerations, which I'll discuss that. Okay, great. Yeah, because look, at the end of the day, what causes these shifts, right? So you have to consider, very basically, you can only have a change in the interest rate if people are demanding money, right? So what's happening is, because the interest rate is the price of money, regardless of you fiddling with the money supply, no one is demanding this money. It's more or less like you'd say the money demand curve is to some extent horizontal. So nothing is really happening, right? The demand is not changing at the end of the day. That's the basic idea, yeah. Because holding money becomes more risky, okay? Yeah. Okay, so look, an important question, of course, we've dealt with the first part. We've more or less talked about the first part of using the ISLM framework to discuss, the effects of fiscal austerity. I think we did that last week. And of course, an important question here now is whether there's room for monetary policy. But see, when answering this question, it's important, what's actually important is for you to consider what policy consideration you will adopt at the end of the day. Or in fact, what option will you take in answering your essay, right? So first of all, if you're looking at this problem from a Eurozone perspective, well, that's highly logical. Like I mentioned last week, when you think of the Eurozone, it's a monetary union, okay? So the monetary union means that the European Central Bank has power over interest rates or has power over money supply. But if you're looking at this case from a country perspective, remember you're in a monetary union. if you're in a monetary union, it means it's a regional integration. In a regional integration, you can't influence money supply as a country. So the only thing you've got control over is fiscal policy. So in your essay, be careful. If you choose to think of this problem from a Eurozone perspective, well, yes, there is a role for money supply there, right? Rather, yeah, there is a role for money supply, and more importantly, monetary policy, all right? But if you choose to look at this from let's say, a country perspective, it's highly impractical for you to actually say, monetary policy is effective, because it's actually not effective. No member country in the Eurozone has the power to influence money supply. Yeah. Well, basically, you look at this issue from, if you look at the Eurozone, you look at it from an average, right? So you look at it from the entire Eurozone, what's happening, what is the interest rate, right, within the Eurozone? Then is it approximating zero? So you can begin to think about a liquidity trap from that perspective, all right? So when you're looking at this problem from a country perspective, you can not influence monetary policy, all right? Regardless of how strong the economy is, be it Germany, be it France, you cannot influence monetary policy, all right? So in thinking about this problem, you need to take into account, I'm looking at this problem from an average perspective. Is there a role for monetary policy? Perhaps yes, perhaps no. I mean, that's part of the question. So if you look at it from a country perspective, I mean, like I mentioned earlier on, you're in a monetary union. In a monetary union, the fundamental characteristic of a monetary union is you surrender your ability to influence money supply, and more importantly, interest rates. All right, is that clear? So, an important aspect now that we would, would really need to think about quite carefully. And of course, as I mentioned earlier on, your policy considerations depend on your initial disposition, right? So if you choose to approach this problem from a regional perspective, that of course means by looking at the Eurozone, it also means that your policies should be tailored for the Eurozone, right? And if you choose to look at it from a country perspective, your policies should be tailored for that country. And in looking at policy, of course, in this case, because remember, you're looking at a macroeconomic problem, right? You're looking at a macroeconomic problem, and more importantly, the effects of fiscal austerity, right, on the Eurozone. So it's also important to understand what is macroeconomic policy. And of course, in understanding macroeconomic policy, it's important to understand who are the role players within defining policy on a macroeconomic level. And of course, this involves the fiscal authority as well as the monetary authority. But basically, what you also need to understand is, why do you need policy on the macroeconomic level? I mean, you guys, I think you may have learned this during the first year level. And the basis of macroeconomic policy, of course, is to influence, the rate of economic growth, to, combat employment, to maintain price stability, which more commonly you choose to call inflation, and to also maintain the balance of payment stability, right? These are some of the fundamental reasons. So generally, when you've got a macroeconomic problem, quite often than not, it normally, falls within these four key objectives, all right? So even how you think about it, yet again, is important when designing policy, because there are certain problems where you find that fiscal policy is actually more appropriate. And when you look at other problems, you find that monetary policy is actually more appropriate. But anyway, we will discuss some of these things as we progress. And it's important to understand how you design policy. And what is actually very important is, what is the policy objective? So in thinking about a policy objective is, you need to have a problem, first of all right? So perhaps the problem could be extremely high inflation, right? So how do you deal with that problem? Or perhaps a problem, the problem could also be, very high fiscal deficits. How do you deal with that problem? And in thinking about this, you need to be able to associate the problem to monetary policy or fiscal policy or a hybrid, the use of both monetary and fiscal policy, all right? So yet again, this is what I just mentioned earlier on. You need to be able to pick a policy instrument. And in this case, when looking at macroeconomic policy, we've got two policy instruments, right? The use of monetary policy or the use of fiscal policy. In certain cases, you might use both monetary and fiscal policy. And it's also important to understand which is more appropriate, right? Because there'll be a case where, for instance, you're dealing with a problem that has to do with redistribution, right? Redistribution due to rising income inequality, right? So it's important for you to think about, if we look at monetary policy, how will monetary policy redistribute income in the economy, right? Is it appropriate? It might be convenient, but less convenient as compared to other policies. But of course, one would argue and say, well, let's focus on fiscal policy. Maybe government might raise taxes. Government might raise taxes, increase their revenue, and redistribute through transfer payments, right? That's how you should think about policy. So it's quite dynamic, but it's important to have that conceptualization within, in your mind. Yeah. So yet again, it's important to be able to evaluate whether the objective has been achieved, having proposed or implemented a policy, all right? So there are times when you implement a policy and that policy might actually bring about other problems. Assuming the economy is in a recession, then you implement an expansionary fiscal policy. Of course, that's going to raise aggregate demand, which effectively translates into an increase in output. But yet again, maybe this policy could be, a 5 to 10 year policy, and you keep, increasing government spending every year. And, by the time you reach the 10th year, you might find that your debt to GDP ratio would have increased substantially. So of course, then you would want to evaluate, you're out of the recession, but where are you, right? At which point are you in the business cycle, or where is your economy at when you look at the macroeconomic indicators? And you'd find that you've got another problem, because that's how macroeconomics is. You fix one problem, and if you're not careful, you create another problem. So those are some of the things you might want to think about. But in terms of this essay, you might want to relate whether the policy objective has been achieved to what the outcomes were, for instance, in the Eurozone, right? So you might want to look at fiscal austerity. So you might look at fiscal austerity and say, look, what was the aim of fiscal austerity? If you all remember from the question, it was to increase market confidence and create jobs, right? So you might want to evaluate and say, well, did fiscal austerity, increase market confidence and create jobs, right? That's how you begin to think about this. Is that clear? And I just thought of a case, a case that would help you think about policy considerations. And in this case, I think I may have mentioned this already. It's something to do with redistribution, right? Think of a case like South Africa, which is facing very high inequality, of course. That's, the huge income disparity between the rich and the poor. Yeah.
Sorry, so I just want to add, with this slide on appropriateness, came to me out of my head. I think also it's important to don't divorce the theory. When you come to a policy recommendation, you can't divorce the theory from reality. So if you're in a specific country of the Eurozone, you also need to be aware that the legitimacy and the credibility of what you're saying in your essay to us needs to also be what's being conveyed currently in the world. So for example, Greece, Portugal, Spain, those countries have been considering exiting the Eurozone. So you almost can't propose a policy that would strengthen ties with the Eurozone when in reality the countries are choosing to remain within the exit. So don't get too caught up in the theory also in your policy recommendation. Try and make sure the theory reflects well the reality and is suitable to that country or to the Eurozone discussion and average.
Okay, great.
I just have a question. You see with the policy, right?
Yes.
Like right now, because we just started like the meeting, you as president of the market, like our essays and stuff, do you think it's best when we like giving like recommendations to keep it in the short run, or just also bring it out in the medium run into our policy? Because usually like we should identify the problem and evaluate the objectives. Do you think it would
Okay, so the question is, today you just started looking at, is it the medium run, right? Yeah, so the basic question is, should, in recommending policy, should you guys focus on the medium term and the long term, right? Richard?
Okay, so the question that we get asked is, what is the long term? Okay, because as soon as you pass through the medium term, you have a new medium term, and you have a new medium term. So when you look at the business cycle, I'm answering your question a long way, for me to better understand. When you look at the business cycle, no economist can ever tell you where you're sitting in the long run of the business cycle, because the long run is really just a theoretical framework. So your policy, however, at a theory level, any policy that you propose is a reaction to something that's already occurred. So it's a short run reaction. You never have a policy for the long run because you can't account for all the variables in the market. So it's not really necessary for you to frame a policy. It's given that a policy at macro level will be for the short to medium run, because that's all we actually know.
Is that clear? Okay, great. Okay, great. So look, I did talk about this and how to begin to think about policy. So if you're talking about redistribution in this case, you might choose to think about, an increase in, in taxes an increase in taxes and perhaps an increase in government spending, right? So what do I mean by this? So you might rather introduce a progressive tax, which means getting more from the poor and more from the rich and less from the poor, and increase transfer payment. That's how you would achieve a redistribution policy. What I'm trying to do here is just to get you thinking on how policy works, right? How you can manipulate the various tools, be it fiscal policy or monetary policy. So another case would be assuming inflation was extremely high in an economy, which policy would you advise the monetary or fiscal authorities to use, all right? So, when you look at the central bank, one of their key roles is to maintain price stability, right? So in the case of extremely high inflation, one of the issues they might choose to look at is, raising the interest rates. Remember, interest rates are the price of money, right? The price of money. So pretty much if the price of money goes up, what does that mean? People want less money, which means borrowing becomes expensive. But yet again, it also gives you an incentive to go and save, thereby reducing money, out of the system, that is, out of the circulation system, and effectively reducing the inflation rate, all right? So in this case, normally, if you're looking at inflation, it can also be done from a fiscal perspective, but quite often than not, the monetary authority always look at the price stability aspect of things. And an important question is, to do with, if an economy is facing fiscal austerity measures, would quantitative easing be an option, right? So this is an important question because, the US had used this. But of course, just to define quantitative easing, it's a case where the central bank tries to inject money into the system, rather into the economy, by purchasing assets, right? So they purchase assets from central banks, right? For instance, if central banks, had bought securities from the domestic money market, the central bank will buy those assets from the commercial banks, right? So in so doing, they increase money in circulation, right? But then the basic idea here is if the monetary authority were to do that, given that the economy was facing fiscal austerity measures, what would be the case? Yeah. Well, pretty much it's quite similar, right? It's quite similar, but with open market operations is when, actually it's the reciprocal, sorry, forgive me, it's the reciprocal. So what happens with open market operations, let's try and look at it from the initial point, right? So what happens is the government will actually sell treasury bills and obtain money from the people, from the domestic money market, right? So you treasury bill, you give the government money and the government is happy, they've got money, right? But with quantitative easing, in fact, it's through commercial banks. That's the major distinction, right? It's through commercial banks. So with open market operations, yet again, what tends to happen is, so first step is you you give an instrument, you give an instrument, take money. Then the second step is give money back, take the instrument back. All right. So with quantitative easing, it's quite similar, but you are purchasing assets through the central bank. I mean, through the commercial banks. But the main distinction is quantitative easing is normally is done from the monetary authorities, whereas open market operations mostly come from the fiscal authorities because you talk of the treasury bills, etc. But of course, there are some open market operations that tend to go through the central bank, but that's not quite a common practice. But that's how you can choose to think about it. Yeah. So this is a very important question, and so when you think about this question, yet again, so you've got a country that's facing fiscal austerity measures. So it means government spending substantially goes down and or an increase in taxes. But then you're trying to stimulate the economy through quantitative easing. Yeah. Any ideas? Any ideas? Anyone? So remember, quantitative easing is you're pumping money into the economy, right? The central bank is pumping money into the economy by buying securities. Yeah. But then you've got fiscal austerity measures, where on the other side, you're trying to reduce government spending. You're trying to reduce government spending and or increasing taxes. Well, it depends. It's a highly debatable factor. It depends on where the level of interest rates are. Yeah. Anyway, so keep this question with you. We'll answer it towards the end. Cool. Great. So I brought back this example, which we did last week, and it's essentially about how the South African government responded to the global recession of 2008. And more importantly, like I mentioned last week, what actually happened is you had a reduction in investment. Because remember, when you're in a recession, generally, one of the most volatile components in a recession is private demand, right? So private demand sometimes relates to investment. So when your investment goes down and the economy goes into a recession, right? So when you're in a recession, remember, private demand is extremely low. How do you stimulate their economy? Because you need a role player there, and that's where the fiscal and the monetary authorities come in, right? But then how do they do this? It could be through an expansionary fiscal policy, or it could be through an expansionary monetary policy. So last week we drew a graph trying to depict how this would look like, right? Using the ISLM framework. We tried to understand, assuming the economy is in a recession, how will the graph look like? Or rather, what do you first consider? And I think I won't draw this graph today, but we can discuss, right? So remember, what we did last week was we mentioned that it's very important each time you're trying to analyze a case to do with a recession, you need to have an initial position, right? So even in your essay, it's important for you to think about this, right? Think about the recession. So how did the Eurozone end up where they were? They were at an initial point, of course, at some point. But then what happened? You had a recession. What shifts? Which curve shifts? What did we shift last week? Do you guys remember? What did we shift? Well, let's think about it. So in a recession, what goes down? Investment, right? So investment goes down. What is investment? It's a component of aggregate demand, right? It's a component of aggregate demand. And aggregate demand is associated with the IS relation. So essentially, if investment goes down, it means that your IS curve will shift to the left, right? To shift downwards, isn't it? Right? So it will shift downwards, goes down to the left. You need to be able to think about these graphs in your head, all right? So you got a graph like that. It goes down to the left, all right? Would you like me to draw it on the board? Okay, cool. At least most of you say, no, I'm glad you guys understand this stuff. But anyway, so you've got your IS curve shifting downwards, and which is important. It means your interest rates are are likely to go down, and you've got your output going down as well, right? So that was what we looked at last week. But then, in a case where they implement an expansionary monetary policy as well as an expansionary fiscal policy, what will happen in this case? Yeah, so in this case, what will you first draw? So you have an initial position, right? Then what do? You will show, from that initial position, you will show the fall in investment due to the recession, isn't it? You shift the IS curve, but then from there, then you implement an expansionary monetary, let's say, fiscal policy. So you will shift the IS curve to the right? Then if you implement an expansion monetary policy, how do you shift the LM curve? Is it to the left or to the right? Because remember, the LM curve is upward sloping. Yeah, let's think about this. Yeah. Because it's upward sloping like that. It's upward sloping. The LM curve is upward sloping. It's like that. It's like that. Will you shift it to the left or to the right? It's an expansionary monetary policy. How will you shift the LM curve? To the left or to the right? This side or this side? To the right. Cool. So you shift it to the right, huh? Well, you could call it a shift downwards or a shift to the right. Yeah. Is that clear? Are you guys seeing how to think about this topic, right? So when you drawing your graph, trying to analyze fiscal austerity, this is how you need to think about it. You need to have an initial position. Then you guys know what fiscal austerity is. You guys will make the relevant shifts.
So going back to the thing where you had quantitative easing, right? So quantitative easing is essentially you can expect a drop in interest rates, right? So that would mean...
Yeah, but that would be in your policy considerations, all right? If you're talking of quantitative easing, it's something that happened in the Eurozone but came later on. Perhaps an important question that you might want to ask, which I told you earlier on, is you might have a case where their economy is in a liquidity trap. How do you indicate that? Remember, in a liquidity trap, nothing is happening to interest rates. So what happens to your LM curve? It just becomes, yeah, that's how to think about it. Yeah. The initial position is the initial point of analysis. So look, what's happening here is, so you've got a case like this, you've got a case like that, all right? Before you start analyzing anything, you need to have an initial position. Remember, you're talking about the recession, but before the recession, the economy must have been somewhere, right? So if your economy was here, right, this is your initial position. So in discussing this, you need to be able to discuss this, graph in detail, right? So you say the economy was here, but what happened after that? You had a recession, right? So you had a recession. After the recession, what happened? Then, the European Union implemented fiscal austerity. Then what happened? All right? That's how you need to think about it. If you create that sequence, you will be able to come up with the graph that actually gives you the actual analysis. I could have drawn it here, but it's more or less like drawing the answer for you guys. It defeats the purpose, isn't it? Right? But you understand the logic behind what I'm saying, right? So you got an initial position. Yeah. Initial position, that's how you begin to analyze, graphs. Anyway, so look, we thought of giving you a structure to this essay, and of course, one of the things that you will consider is a basic introduction, right? So you have an introduction to your essay. What you put in your introduction is entirely at your discretion. I mean, this is at the second year level. But of course, there are certain things that we expect in an introduction. It needs to be concise and to the point. And more importantly, it should have perhaps a thesis statement, right? It should have a thesis statement. You guys know what a thesis statement is, isn't it? It just gives a quick summary of what your essay is and perhaps also outline some of your key findings, all right? So, for instance, this is just an example. You might argue that fiscal austerity was a very good policy for the Eurozone, right? That's an example, right? So don't go and say this, an example. You might say fiscal austerity, in your thesis statement, fiscal austerity was a good policy for the Eurozone, okay? And you might add the rest. So yet again, in having a good essay, especially around this topic, you might choose to give, a background to the European debt crisis. And of course, it would be important to give the reader some flavor on how this crisis started. And yet again, because there were some countries that were affected substantially within this process. And you might want to consider perhaps highlighting one of the countries that was greatly affected, right, in the Eurozone when this crisis hit, just to add some flavor. Then you might also want to just highlight contagion effects, right? Because contagion effects, if one country is substantially affected in a monetary union, it's got spillover effects on other countries. But of course, this should not be in detail. It's just, a little small passage just to show that you understand what you're talking about and how this crisis became, as huge as it is or was, all right? Then, of course, another issue that you might want to highlight within this section is to draw a comparison. Because, look, this crisis started from the US, right? And they addressed it using certain measures. They were so keen on, an expansionary fiscal policy, while the Eurozone decided to, implement an austerity fiscal policy. And, of course, this presents a very stunning paradox. I mean, you might want to look at some of the reasons why the US did that and was policy effective in the US. You might want to look at that in brief. And you might want to also analyze whether it was, implementing austerity fiscal measures was appropriate. Okay? Then an important aspect, of course, the third part or third section of this essay should perhaps give some flavor for the ISLM framework. And within this section, you might want to draw your graphs appropriately. But what would be nice to see is, remember, this is at the second year level. We're just trying to understand how well you've got a command of explaining graphs. So what you might want to do here is explain graphs in detail. Like I mentioned earlier on, don't forget their initial position. It's very important, right? Because I know those students who did not come here and, no wonder didn't even put that, in the slides. Because I know, those who don't come get to lose out. Because what's going to happen is I know some people are going to explain this graph by assuming the recession has occurred already, which should not be the case because it's defeating the purpose of analysis, all right? Yeah. So you should be able to think about the initial position. You get into a recession, but what does the Eurozone, the European Union do? Then they decide to implement fiscal austerity, right? That chain of events. Explain that, there to there, all right? Yeah, and you should be good. After doing that, you should be fine. And the conclusion essentially depends on your initial disposition and the arguments you may have used within your essay, right? This strongly depends on you, and how you present this conclusion is entirely, based on whether you took option 1, that is looking at the Eurozone, or whether you took option 2, that is looking at a specific country. And an important aspect, of course, is your policy recommendations, which we've discussed earlier on. So in thinking about policy, right? In thinking about policy, it's important to think about, well, if we're focusing on the Eurozone, what could the Eurozone do, all right? So some alternatives, for instance, is, of course, you've got a crisis within the Eurozone, and there are certain countries that are doing quite bad, right? But yet again, you might have countries that are doing relatively well. Why not an expansionary fiscal policy for countries that are doing exceptionally well, and that might have spillover effects? That's just an idea I'm throwing to you guys, and it won't be in the slides, though. It's just an idea I'm throwing to you guys. All right? That's how you need to begin to think about this. Yeah. Sorry? I should repeat the idea. She heard it won't be in the slides and she wants me to repeat it. Anyway, the idea is, look, in a case where you're looking at this problem from, a Eurozone perspective, all right? So remember, we mentioned earlier on, and I also highlighted the fact that, the question says the economy might be in a liquidity trap. The question actually says that. You know that, right? Do you guys know the question says the country is in a liquidity trap? Do you guys know that? Have you read the question? Who's read the question? For those of you who read the question, do you note the part that says the country is in a liquidity trap? Did you note that? Did you see that? It's not explicit, but it wants you to be able to apply the definition of a liquidity trap. It tells you interest rate, private demand is extremely low, interest rates are approximating zero. That's a definition of a liquidity trap. So it already gives you that idea. In this, I won't be in the slides. Okay? So you need to think about things like this. Yeah. Yeah. So look, there's certain countries that, you might agree on a certain level. Look, there are certain countries that are doing exceptionally well in the Eurozone, right? Yeah. And there are certain countries that are doing quite bad, right? So you've got countries like, I didn't want to mention it, but Greece. Greece is doing really, really bad. So you might have a country is in good financial stance and doesn't really need to shrink its fiscal deficit substantially. Because these fiscal austerity measures are just meant to shrink the fiscal deficit. So you might have countries that are doing quite well, and I don't want to mention those countries as part of your homework. But then, so with those countries, they might choose to carry out an expansionary fiscal policy, and in so doing, this might have spillover effects on their economy. It's a policy consideration. Even yet again, when you think about fiscal austerity, right? Fiscal austerity, I've tried by all means to try and avoid whether to mention whether fiscal austerity is bad or good. But what's your general feeling? Is it bad or good? Is it bad or good? Is it harsh? So look, it's a highly debatable issue, right? But of course, when you think about the idea behind fiscal austerity was good, but I mean, at that particular point in time, it seems like quite a flawed policy, right? Because what you were trying to do is to increase market confidence. Remember, for a country like Greece, they had, a very high fiscal deficit, and let alone a high, debt to GDP ratio. But when you look at their actual overall GDP, it was quite low. So I mean, there are times when a country's got very high debt to GDP ratio, but effectively their GDP is growing year by year, year by year. I mean, you might argue that country will be able to pay back whatever it owes later on. But with Greece, it was the reciprocal. GDP was substantially low. The GDP to debt ratio was quite high. So what would one think about? Well, let's think of an austerity, let's look at an austerity measure and restrict a lot of government spending. Let's pay back what we owe. But of course, when you look at fiscal austerity, who suffers is generally the people within the economy, because you're going to raise taxes substantially, reduce government spending. But the whole idea is to increase market confidence. Because remember, just rationally thinking, the more you owe, right, the higher the risk of you defaulting. So if you have a friend who owes you, let's say, 1,000 rands, and he or she wants to borrow an extra 1,000 rands, this increases the chances of him or her defaulting, isn't it? That's the case with Greece. So perhaps it would be an idea to say, well, let's shrink the deficit, let's gain market confidence. Maybe this might lead to a recovery process, because no one wanted to lend money to Greece. If you lend money to Greece, it's like a drop in the ocean. Those are just some of the ideas that you guys, will normally get for coming to the workshop. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So it's like it's a belt, right? So it's a it's like how would I? You're in a monetary union, so most decisions come from the European Union, and they just decide to impose a policy. Yeah, and sorry. Sorry, come again? No, it's not really a big issue. I mean, it's not really a big issue because, I mean, that's the way government gets to spend money and gets to earn money. So it's not really a big issue. It's all about, manipulating policy in order to achieve your macroeconomic objectives. It's not really a big issue. But, I mean, the problem comes in when, because most of these countries have a similar trajectory. But what happened with Greece is Greece was falsifying information. They were saying, because they were saying they've got a very low, debt to GDP ratio, which was actually false, right? So, I mean, if you've got 5 countries in a monetary union, right, and let's say they all have an 80% debt to GDP ratio, you might choose to perhaps, enact a contraction in monetary policy, right? Which means all countries will achieve stability at the same time. But what was happening with Greece is they were actually lying. So there were times when the Eurozone decided to implement an expansionary monetary policy that would affect Greece because the economy would be overheating, right? You've got very high debt already, and if you've got an expansionary policy, it means there's more money in circulation, more borrowing, and people became highly indebted. It's some of those issues. That's one of the major problems with the Eurozone. Yeah. You guys seem confused. Did I make sense? Cool. Any more questions? What's the solution to this? You mean what's the answer to the essay? But I just gave you guys some very good ideas. Yeah. I just gave you guys some very good ideas. So think around those. Everything I've been doing here is very, very important. All right? It's very, very important. I just want you guys to get thinking, right? Think about this issue and, yeah. So these are some of the basic technicalities that even very good students do badly at, right? So referencing is very, very important, and I've noticed in the past a lot of people have lost a lot of marks because of this, and it's really sad. You see someone writes a very good piece, but the referencing is bad. But but of course, if someone that does not reference their work, it also brings in the issue of credibility, right? Someone brings in the issue of credibility and says, no, this work is plagiarized. It's things like this. So you forget your in-text referencing, then you have got a problem. If your reference list is wrong, then you've got a problem. If your punctuation, one thing that people don't generally, students don't generally understand is when you talk of referencing, right? What actually differentiates from various referencing styles is the punctuation. Okay? So a comma, a full stop, a colon, a semicolon really matters in referencing. So if you put, a square bracket as opposed to, round bracket, it means something else. It's something different, totally different. So no wonder it's important to consult the Harvard referencing manual on how to do these things, keep refreshing your mind, and it's quite important to do that. And of course, try and use authoritative or original sources. So try and avoid using sources like, Wikipedia. So Wikipedia it's a good source to get some understanding about a concept, all right? So you can look at Wikipedia. I use Wikipedia as well. Just go and, just Google something quickly, and you get the logic or intuitive understanding to something. But you can't use Wikipedia to write an essay because the biggest issue is there is a chance that the information might be wrong because it's not authoritative it's not original because Wikipedia can be edited by anyone, all right? Which effectively means there is a high probability that the information might be compromised. And even worse, Wikipedia, when you look at information from Wikipedia, some people tend to obtain that information from other articles, right? So, but then when they get information from other articles, they paraphrase it and it becomes distorted. At the end of the day, the meaning may have changed within the essay. So just take care of this. I mean, it would be sad to see some of you that would have done exceptionally well on the content side just to lose marks like that. And these are just some of the basic, formatting requirements. 1.5 line spacing. Please do that. I mean, it's got an effect on the marker as well, right? I really love to see pretty work. When the work is pretty, I'm happy. Because, I mean, you look at the paper, like, this person put in some time to write this piece, all right? And what's the other important thing here? Make sure your graphs are big, all right? So close to half a page should do. Yeah. Show all the movements, all the shifts. You guys are patrons of the art when it comes to this. And, well, these are some of the important dates. Of course, the essay is due on the 14th of September. And hot seats run on the 7th to the 11th. Tutorial workshops run from the 7th to the 11th as well. And this marks the end of today's session. Yeah. Have you all completed your names? Look, if you have any questions, you can just come forth and we can have a chat while I